Cook was a key voice and a figure in a disruptive era that we should make sure is part of our collective memory. In 1972, there were about 800,000 American Indians in the United States. And at that time, the Census Bureau estimated that roughly 185,000 tribal citizens lived in urban areas. Today, the census figures that number at about 7 out of 10 Native Americans living in cities, topping more than 3 million people. Some of that number is because the census has changed the way it counts, starting in about 1970. Before that year, the agency figured that the Native American population was only growing at about 1% per year, a figure that nearly every demographer thought was nonsense. But the 1970s were important for another reason. It was during that time when tribes started to be serious about urban populations, reaching out to tribal citizens who lived and worked in cities. On January 15, 1972, representatives from 6 urban centers gathered in Oakland, California to send a message that it was long past time for the country to have services for urban Native populations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs dismissed the meeting, saying that all federal funds will go to reservations. The premise, of course, is that the United States relationship was directly with tribal nations. But urban Native Americans should get services that they're entitled to, just as any other citizens of cities, counties, and states. The National American Indian Council was formed by some 300 delegates representing 58 cities. The council met in Omaha, Nebraska in March 1972 and called for the extension of federal services to all Indians. Lee Cook, Red Lake Ojibwe, was president of the National Congress of American Indians. He invited the new organization to join a broader coalition on Native issues. He said it was practical and politically expedient to organize needs as you define them. Under Cook's leadership, NCAI revised its membership to include Native people living in cities. NCAI cannot take a stand against its own people, whether they are urban or not. NCAI's director, Leo Vasu, who's Ogallala, said, urban Indians are not getting their fair share of city services, and NCAI would support them getting a fair share. Lee Cook was a key voice in the debate. He was a figure from this era that we should really make sure is part of our collective memory. So I reached out to Holly Cook McCarroll to talk about her uncle. Before we go on, take a moment, hit that subscribe button, comment, share. Help us get the word out about Indigenous House and breaking history. I'm Mark Trahant. My conversation with Holly Cook McCarroll.
You know, Lee was an uncle to me and on my dad's side, and he really was on a personal level an inspiration for really wanting to do politics. I remember being at Lee's house as a child and seeing the pictures of him with Mondale, you know, with all of these elected officials. When we talk about being able to see that happen, it didn't seem like it was impossible for me to go and do political work, right? And because I'd seen Lee do that. And Lee's story is one I think about. He broke so many barriers from being elected to the tribal council as an urban representative and inspiring then an amendment to the Constitution that then banned urban representatives to the Red Lake Tribal Council. But his daughter last week had found an old shirt where it said, you know, Lee Cook for alderman. And then to the footage that we've seen where he was nominated as vice president at the Chicago Convention in 68.
Our regularly scheduled program will not be seen tonight so that ABC News can bring you color coverage of the 1968 Democratic National Convention.
The last piece of bunting is in place in the arena of the International Amphitheater here in Chicago at 7:30 tomorrow night Chicago time. John Bailey, chairman of the National Committee, will open the party's 35th convention. The 10th time the Democrats have convened in Chicago, the 4th time in this hall.
Which was extraordinary. And to see him up on the podium, those old pictures of Lee up on the podium and speaking. To then move on to his time under Louis Bruce, when they decided to bring in, you know, Indians for the first time to run the BIA, and that whole cadre, which they called the Katzenjammer Kids, and getting into all sorts of good trouble there. I say good trouble from an administrative standpoint. And then Lee resigned in protest about the treatment of Louis Bruce by some in the administration, and some of the things, you know, that were happening or not happening in the administration. And then immediately ran turned around and ran for president of NCAI. So he was elected, and I believe in the fall of 1971, if I recall correctly, as president of NCAI, and served in that position through the historic, was it Tulsa in '74, I believe? Those were absolutely historic times in terms of activism, butting heads with those who had decided to work on the inside, how that all came together in terms of leadership of the National Congress of American Indians at that time. It's an important piece of history in how we could work in Indian country from the inside and out. With what some saw as an opportunity. We were moving from complete control and administration by the federal government on Indian lands towards self-determination and self-governance, which was a huge growing pain and understandably a scary thing for tribal leadership back then. Watching what I've learned, about the American Indian movement and what I know about the activism, I would say administrative activism within the walls by folks like Ernie Stevens and Lee Cook and others. It's an important story, and I'm really proud of Lee's voice, and he was always a character in our family, and we miss him. It was just his birthday last week. So
you think of creative disruption, and of course now we're going through, and it's kind of mean-spirited, but the creative disruption at the BIA during that period, when you had really 2 centuries of bureaucrats doing things exactly the same way all the time, and then to have this force of folks saying, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, and I think it put our Native folks in a very difficult position, right?
We are now in a period of disruption. It's a crazy disruption, but the 1970s had its own share of crazy disruption, and the BIA certainly was a big part of that.
Yes, absolutely, and I think looking at the team that was there and the experience they brought with them is such a fascinating piece of history, because we have to learn from that. We have to learn from the folks who went in a very difficult atmosphere with not a lot of structural support within, and maybe that's why none of them lasted very long. And then we had the takeover of the BIA, but the entire structure and the disruption that was happening both inside and outside the walls. This is when we were having, we had Wounded Knee in '73, we had Jumping Bull in '75, we had these changes going on. And Lee's election as NCAI president, I really think also symbolizes a change from the old guard to the new kids. He ran against Earl Oldperson, who, what a tremendous tribal leader, an iconic historic figure in Indian country, and who was against self-governance, on all of those pieces. And I completely understand it, because that had to have been such an unknown for tribal leadership. If we go that way, do we lose our funding? Are we putting all of that in jeopardy? And so answering those questions in the unknown of whether the federal government would live up to the commitments and support of self-governance and self-determination was kind of that election when Lee was elected in 1971 of, does the old guard win? Does the new guard win? And so when Lee won, and it really was, I think, a change in voice at the National Congress, and leaning towards that new day, and some of the legislation that we saw pass in the late 1970s, from the Religious Freedom Act to the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, or what we call ISDA, which is the foundation of so much of the work that we do today, and point to as the laws that, from land into trust to federal recognition and beyond. It's almost hard to in just a few minutes encompass the disruption that was happening inside, outside, and what that resulted in.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, one of those disruptions was a debate about federal services directed toward urban Indians. Neither the Bureau of Indian Affairs nor the Indian Health Service has ever taken that mission on, at least in a big way. A Bureau of Indian Affairs report in 1972 did make a suggestion to expand services, in fact, recommending $9.3 million to be sent for Indians in cities, whether or not they lived on or off reservations. The report was prepared at the request of then Representative Julia Butler Hanson from Washington State, who was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. The report was authored by Ernie Stevens Sr., Alexander Sandy McNabb, and others in BIA leadership. The American Indian, or the Native American so-called, has rights in this land which predate all subsequent rights which have been accrued to Europeans and other immigrants to the United States, the report said. The rights of Indians were steadily eroded with each new wave of settlers. Illegal and broken treaties, disease, war, manifest destiny, and downright deception, together with negligent performance of the federal trust, have aided this erosion. The BIA actually recommended spending $46 million on urban programs out of a $1 billion budget. But the Nixon administration said no. From the White House, Frank Carlucci wrote Interior to say that the BIA's responsibility does not extend to Indians who have left the reservation. He said there were other federal agencies that could fill that role. Carlucci had been head of the Office of Economic Opportunity, the very agencies he said should be supporting urban Indian programs. Yet that agency spent only about $600,000 on such efforts. That huge gap, healthcare, social service, housing, remains as great as ever. I'm Mark Trahant, and this is Breaking History.